Good afternoon and happy Women's History Month. My name is Ellen Snortland, and this is for Pasadenans Organizing for Progress. My co host, Hannah Petrie, will not be with me today, and I will be talking about my passion, which is women's history. Um, I'll talk quite a bit about women's suffrage, which is the right to vote, because this is the 100th anniversary of women winning the right to vote, which does not mean they had access to the vote, which is an entirely different thing, which I'll get into today. Um, my name, as I said, is Ellen Snortland, and my last name sounds a lot better in Norway. Phonetically, it's spelled land. And by the way, women in Norway won the vote in 1913. My grandmother would write to her relatives in Norway and kind of go, na, 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 you're not better. But she was frustrated because both my grandmothers were married with kids and they couldn't vote until 1920. And one of the outcomes I'd like to have for today is to have you look into when the women in your country of origin won the vote. For instance, women in Mexico did not win the vote until 1953. And there were women in Switzerland who couldn't vote until the 1970s. So it's not that historical, it's not that far back that we go. And a bit about me, I'm a non-practicing lawyer, I'm a writing coach and a columnist. I'm also the author of several books, including Beauty Bites Beast, which I also made into an award-winning feature-length documentary, which if you haven't seen, I really encourage you to see it. And before I go any further, I would be remiss if I didn't thank my husband, Ken Gruberman, who is my music and graphics wrangler. And I like to say that men used to be vital for hunting and fishing, and now they are vital for computer troubleshooting. And boy, did I score. But that's not simple flattery for Ken. My husband's support of me as a person is germane to my talk because think about it for a second. How do you win the vote when you're not able to vote? You enlist other people who can vote in the righteousness of your cause, right? So let's see. Um, I just lost my view of my notes. Okay, let's see. Uh, where are they? Sorry about that. Um, okay, so here we're back. And okay, let me give you a little history about the National Women's History Project. In 1980, Molly McGregor, a history teacher, was asked by a young man, well, what does women's liberation mean? Can you describe it? And she didn't have a clue. So she went home to her big library of history books and started looking up women's history and found one paragraph out of dozens and dozens and dozens of books, maybe a paragraph about women winning the vote. And so she was like, wow, how did I miss that we're missing? And as a result of that, she started the Women's History Project, the National Women's History Project. So it wasn't just local in Santa Rosa. And she also coordinated and lobbied Congress to designate March as National Women's History Month. So since 1987, Women's History Month has been celebrated across the nation. And I think that not enough people know about it, but that's my peculiar take on it. I think people have done a great job in letting people know February is Black History Month. I don't know what we need to do to make Women's History Month go more viral. But we're known nationally as the primary source of information for educators, community organizations, and anyone wanting to expand their understanding of women's contributions to U.S. women's history. And I'm proud to say that I'm on the board. It's a perfect fit for me. The National Women's History Alliance is a leader in promoting women's history and is committed to the goals of education, empowerment, equality, and inclusion. So, back to the issue of women's suffrage. It's useful to provide a context for it that is still resonating today. Voter suppression. We don't often look at women having to fight for the vote as a suppression issue, but it really was. It took women organizing for 72 years from 1848 to 1920 to win the vote. And if people say that the vote was given us, no, it wasn't. Nobody gave us anything. We had to scrap inch by inch by inch by inch in the most peaceful, planned, and impactful social movement yet seen on this planet. And, by the way, Gandhi got his ideas from watching these women. The women's suffrage movement was organized to overturn centuries of wholesale suppression of women's right to vote, along with their unpaid labor and citizenship rights. So, some basics. The germinal source for the history of women in U.S. suffrage and the labor movement is Eleanor Flexner's A Century of Struggle, the women's rights movement in the U.S. Flexner was way ahead of her time as she was writing about intersectionality before almost anyone else. She talked about the Jewish women in the United States, African American women in the United States. It was an amazing piece of scholarship that most people don't even know about. So, also, to give you more context, the women's rights movement is a tapestry. It's not just events, but it's a tapestry woven by women of the coeducational movement, abolition, temperance, and labor crusades. All these threads more or less coalesced into the suffrage movement because they saw that being able to vote was key to many of these other issues. So whenever or wherever there are no paid or low paid workers, you have conditions for a movement. We have always been in US history, whether acknowledged or not. All of us, of all colors, all backgrounds, and women were involved with the building of the railroads, for instance, mines, fields, and orchards. Now, there are two women I want to underline here, and we need to know about them all, I think. One is relatively well known, the other one is, I just found out about her this month. Lucy Parsons. Lucy Parsons was born into slavery, and she turned her emancipation into a radical dedication to workers. Wow. Lucy Parsons, she was a radical anarchist, labor activist, and socialist. She was so outrageous, she even married a former white Confederate soldier. And I love her quote, "The reinvention of daily life means marching off the edges of our maps." And, you know, it's interesting to reflect what maps we might be following. Is it a map that we made up for ourselves, or is it a map that somebody else made up for us? Many people know that Cesar Chavez would not have been as successful without his right-hand person, Dolores Huerta. And she said and says, she's incredibly active and a dear friend of mine, every moment is an organizing opportunity, every person a potential activist, every minute a chance to change the world. And she lives that way. Now, you may not know this. Before women's vote became law in 1920 with the 19th Amendment, women could vote in some places in America. For example, New Jersey women could vote as early as 1776. New Jersey's first constitution in 1776 gave voting rights to all inhabitants of the colony of full age who are worth 50 pounds and have resided within the country for 12 months, for the county. That included women and Black people. In 1790, the New Jersey legislature reworded the law to say he or she, clarifying that both men and women had voting rights. But only single women could vote because married women could not own property. and was considered part of the property of her husband. Now, in 1807, the vote was rescinded for anyone not white, tax-paying, and male. It was, among other things, a blatant political move to suppress Federalists. So suppressing the vote is an old trick in U.S. government and U.S. governance. The U.S. history of women's rights to vote rightly belongs to all of us, including people who have traditionally been left out of most history books. And certainly, we don't talk about voter suppression in most U.S. history books. We don't talk about the missing people either. And one group consistently missing from these stories are the Iroquois. A French name, they referred to themselves as the Haudenosaunee. And as far as we know, they had the longest standing and working democracy in the world. Forget the Greeks. They only let the men above a certain class vote and no one else. Now, the Iroquois Confederacy was born out of chaos, out of constant warring, and the clan mothers told the guys, look, this is not sustainable. You've got to get together. So they formed a kind of a pre-runner to the United Nations, and all these different nations within the Haudenosaunee area, which was over a large part of the northeast US and into Canada, created a confederacy where they had to agree on different policies and get together. So this is where we enter the US history part of it, other than the geography. Ben Franklin, everybody knows who Ben Franklin was, knew about the Iroquois and their 1,000 years of democracy. So he invited Iroquois chiefs to speak to the Continental Congress as the Congress attempted to form a more perfect union. Now, what do you think the first thing that the Iroquois men asked when they walked into the room with all these bewigged and dandy European colonists? The first question was, where are the women? They could not believe a democratic form of governance was being created with 50% of the population left out. So I've adopted where are the women as my lifelong question. And I invite you to do that as well. Just because you can't see women doesn't mean they're not there or what they've done is not worthy of history. I always ask, where are the women? And not all women won the vote when the 19th Amendment was ratified. White women won the vote, and some black women in the North. Otherwise, Southern black women, Native American women, and Asian women were left out in the cold. Southern black women didn't really win the right to vote until the mid-1960s. Native American women didn't win it until kind of a spotty history, depending on what state they were in. And then Asian women were left out until the repeal of the Chinese Immigration Act. And they lumped all the Asian people into Chinese because, you know, white people couldn't tell the difference. Um, so it's a spotty history and there's nothing tidy about it. So let's go back to this book for a minute. Sisters in Spirit. You see the clan mother as the central figure, and then you see three major European beginners of the suffrage movement, and they are from, I guess it's your left, yes, from left to right. Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Matilda Joslyn Gage, and Lucretia Mott. And what they have in common is that they were all deeply influenced by the Haudenosaunee women. There is no way that these white women just suddenly dreamed, oh, we could vote. It wasn't even on their radar as a possibility. It did not exist in the way they viewed the world. So how that spark happened is initially Lucretia Mott and her Laugh a Minute husband James, look at they're so stern. They were Quaker preachers and missionaries, Quakers being the only denomination that allowed women to speak in public. So they decided they would be missionaries to the Iroquois. During their time with the tribes, Lucretia and James learned that women in these nations had full and equal rights with the men and had had them for centuries. So they were the ones that were converted, not the Iroquois, also known as the Haudenosaunee. So this was the spark that led to the Seneca Falls Convention of 1848, and then eventually the 19th Amendment, which is what we're celebrating this year for the 100th anniversary. So one thing that breaks my heart is that the most visible white suffragists, Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony, died before the 19th Amendment passed, and they never got to vote. But that didn't stop them from giving their entire lives over to that cause. Now, compare and contrast. Take a look at this Punch magazine illustration. On the left, you can see the women of European descent fighting for the basics. And on the right, the women of the Iroquois are pitying the colonizers. And this says, we, the women of the Iroquois, own the land, the lodge, the children. Ours is the right of adoption, of life or death. Ours the right to raise up and depose chiefs. Oh, how we could have used that in the last 4 years. Ours the right of representation at all councils. Ours the right to make and abrogate treaties. Ours the supervision over domestic and foreign policies. Ours the trusteeship of the tribal property. Our lives are valued again as high as man's. And the Iroquois women were saying in the Punch illustration, we whom you pity as drudges reached centuries ago that which you are now nearing. Excuse me. There were many black suffragists too. Here is our rendition of Mount You Should Have Rushed More Allies. There were suffragists in every ethnicity, and very few people realize that these famous African Americans, including Frederick Douglass on the left, Harriet Tubman, Sojourner Truth, and Ida B. Wells, all worked to win the vote. Very hard. Frederick Douglass stands out because he was the only black man at the Seneca Falls Convention in 1848. So he not only advocated for the black vote, but also for women to vote. And then I'll touch on this a little later, what happened to set the African American males up against the white suffragists, as in, well, I'll talk about that later. So meanwhile, yeehaw, back at the ranch, the first U.S. state where women permanently won the vote was Wyoming in 1869. Women first won the vote in the territories in the West to push the vote for statehood. Men in those territories wanted as many votes for statehood as they could get and were happy to bring the women aboard. And this happened in regions where women were most likely valued as true partners. You try to homestead, run a ranch or farm without a woman, she could work as hard as any man, make good food too, and oh yeah, produce more farm hands or ranch hands. So after the Wyoming territory, these territories followed suit. The territory of Utah, 1870, the territory of Washington, 1883, the territory of Montana, 1887, and the state of Colorado in 1893. And then in 1911, California became the sixth state in the Union where women secured the vote and had voting rights including voting for president before the 19th Amendment passed in 1920. Before the 19th Amendment came the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, also known as the Civil Rights or Reconstruction Amendments. Briefly, and this is just very, very simplistic on my part because it's complicated in many ways. After the 13th Amendment abolishing slavery and the 14th Amendment bestowing full citizenship, Southern states watched in horror as former slaves ran for office and won because of their new status as citizens and other black men voting for them. So here's another thing that most people don't know is that many suffragists registered to vote using the argument of the 14th Amendment's Equal Protection Clause. That didn't work out so well. They got arrested and didn't get to vote. But they did it. They did it. They did it peacefully and in a full throttle civil disobedience. And the 14th Amendment gave rise to the 15th Amendment, which specified males specifically and created a rift between lifelong friends Susan B. Anthony, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, and Frederick Douglass. And the framers of the 15th Amendment knew exactly what they were doing because you divide, you conquer. So the former slaves were put in an untenable position. Were they to win the vote as black men or hold out for universal suffrage so that all women could vote, including black women, they, were in a tough position. Here's the chance to get their hands on the vote. And they just hoped that it wouldn't backfire. Well, backfire it did. And Frederick Douglass was brokenhearted when he decided to gamble his friendships with suffragists, black and white, by denying them inclusion in the 15th Amendment. I'm happy to report that Frederick Douglass and Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton eventually healed their friendships and saw the 15th Amendment as the voter suppression wedge that it really was. Imagine how upset the women were. Sold out yet again. Drunks, non-English speakers, illiterates, and certifiably insane men could all vote, but the women couldn't. So the Reconstruction Amendment's backlash resulted in more voter suppression, even though black men had the right to vote. Jim Crow laws were created in the southern states to keep them from the poll. And the methods they used were very effective. Poll taxes, crazy exams like having people guess the number of jelly beans in a jar, and the ultimate disincentive, brutal, ugly lynchings. The threat of force will win almost always. So during the campaign leading to 1920 and the passage of the Women's Suffrage Amendment, many Southerners were against women's suffrage because they were afraid that black women would vote. So the KKK and other white male supremacist groups used the same tactics against black women as they did to black men, scaring them away from the vote. So I get this question a lot, and that is, well, why did it take so long for U.S. women to win the vote? There are several factors. Again, all of this stuff is a weaving a tapestry. Ridicule is a huge factor. While maintaining that women were only designed for the home sphere, men were afraid of taking up the slack in the home if women had a role outside of it, which included voting. Besides, if you can have a whole group of unpaid people doing laundry, cooking, washing diapers, performing childcare and elder care, think of all that hidden free labor. And then there was fear. If you've been raised to believe your very survival depends upon a man providing for you, and the only outside jobs for women didn't pay enough to live independently, all women were subjected to much lower wages than men. Well, if that's going on, you're going to cling to survival, which leaves out women who were single or widowed. And it was definitely scary to win the vote. And then money. As in any movement toward equality, it's a good idea to follow the money. And in this case, the liquor business was enormous, and the idea of women having a say in it being banned went straight to the heart of a vast industry, ranging from the farmers who grew the crops for booze to the distributors to the bar owners and the railroads, very deep pocketed. The railroads didn't like the idea of women voting either. They supplied the freight trains for crops, for kegs, for bottles. Liquor was a colossal commerce. Now, the irony here is that the 18th Amendment, which is known as the Prohibition Amendment, was passed before women could vote. So, um, authority. That's another big factor in this weaving. Science and many in the clergy warned women that if they voted, their ovaries would dry up and they would no longer be able to have children. That might have backfired because if you already have 10 kids, you're going to say, hey, give me that ballot. Sounds great to me. Then there were the thousands and thousands of women who were against the vote. They were able to marshal a massive anti-suffrage campaign because they were generally white, well off, and could afford to throw fundraisers like parties and dinner parties and raise funds to oppose the vote. I know, many people are shocked at the idea of women being against getting the vote, but when you consider it, a lot of religions put women into the helper role and not the head of the family or even having any kind of say in public life. As it is in some homes today, it was firmly believed that women had no place in public life. To conclude, there's nothing new about purging voter rolls, scare tactics, forcing entire groups to jump through various hoops just to exercise their right to vote. What is new is the internet bringing people all over the country together along with people-powered video journalism. And this newly connected community means that many citizens are now actively involved in suppressing the suppressors. So we would love to have you join the National Women's History Alliance and consider visiting our online store and buying resources for the next big hullabaloo for women's history, which is August 26th, the date that the ratification of the 19th Amendment went into effect. And encourage boys to learn so-called women's history too. It's a misnomer because it's really all our history. It's not women's history. It's not girls' history. It's all our histories, except, in order to have people start to see just how missing we are from the narrative, I think we're lucky to have a month that we mark it. And I would just really love it if you have any questions that you put them in the chat, and I'll have my husband Ken um, read them to me because I can't answer and read at the same time. Okay, no
Hmm.
questions there.
Hmm.
Hmm. I'm going to address something, and that is I keep hearing Americans use the term suffragette, which is not accurate. Um, Americans are suffragists because it's a gender neutral term, and the genesis of the term suffragette was a disgruntled white male dominated press in England who were appalled at the idea of women having a say in policy. So there were famous and influential men in England who were absolutely pro women's vote, including George Bernard Shaw, John Stuart Mill. And so, in order to humiliate them, the men in their peer group started calling them suffragettes because whenever you put ETTE behind a name as a suffix, it minimizes it, basically. And there were rumors that NASA was actually considering calling women astronauts astronettes, which I'm glad that got the thumbs down. Can you imagine calling the Supreme Court justices justicettes, or, you know, it's a, it's, I don't know. People can be so silly, can't we? And then I always used to think that if we'd had better songs in the women's movement, we could have gotten further faster. And then just to look at what it took to get dressed. Um, no wonder women didn't have time to lobby for the vote. They, it took them 2 hours to get dressed, 2 hours to get undressed, and by the time they had done that, they were exhausted and couldn't go out. But I jest. It's amazing that they did as much as they did, really. Um, and that Gandhi saw with his own eyes, late by months, but he saw as a young lawyer in Africa, South Africa, that uh, civil disobedience and nonviolent social change and spectacles worked. Alice Paul, who I didn't get into in this formal part of the presentation, loved to make spectacles, and so she coordinated the first uh, parade for a cause down Pennsylvania Avenue, and that was in 1913. And there was racism going on for sure. The black women who had been working their butts off to win the vote for everyone weren't allowed to march with some of their delegations from different states. And good old Ida B. Wells, she just crashed the formation and marched anyway. And that 1913 march was attacked by lots of hooligans and cops, and um, it was it was scandalous that women were out in public marching. Also, Alice Paul coordinated what were called the Silent Sentinels, and they were the first group to picket the White House. They were very quiet, they didn't talk, they held signs and pointed out the hypocrisy of President Wilson going to fight a war for democracy in Europe, and half of the population could not vote. It's like, didn't make much sense to them.
I think it may be a time to have the Silent Sentinels return to the governor's mansion in Georgia,
Yeah,
and maybe not so silent.
yeah. That the voice behind the curtain is my very own white man, Ken Gruberman. And I think everybody on this call knows him.
Yeah.
You know what? You can unmute your videos. We can see each other if you'd like, and you don't have to. Hi, Kathy. Hi, Ria. Yeah,
Mr. Elliott's off there.
yeah,
I'm glad he's here.
yeah. Me too. So, were you surprised by anything in this presentation?
I'm always learning new things from you, and there were indeed some things I did not know, I'm sorry to say, and I'm going to look forward to getting my daughter involved in some of this and reading, watching your video, reading up on some of these things, and I plan to do so myself.
I'll give you a tip that an editor gave to me that I use a lot. And I had been, as a journalist, put in the position of having to interview people that I didn't know their field at all. And he said, go get a kid's book.
Mm.
It will get you up to speed really quickly because um, kid lit authors pick the stickiest things, the most, outrageous or most fun or most like, what? Really? Things. And the National Women's History Alliance has a big selection of kids' books. And we have curricula for grade school teachers and packets for August 26th to, have balloons and all that kind of stuff. My dream is to really celebrate Women's Equality Day like we celebrate other holidays as a big holiday for nonviolent social change and voter registration. So, so we chased Elliot away.
Yeah.
Oh yeah.
I was really surprised by the bit about the Iroquois.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. And most of the indigenous nations have a matrilineal and matriarchal setup, which, people in our culture go, oh, so the women bossed the men around. It's like, no, it was not set up as an either or structure. It was pretty much all hands on deck and no dominating group over the other. And it wasn't until, you know, there became this binary view of the world, which is a hallmark of patriarchy, that uh, one group was supposed to submit to the other. And maybe
Yeah.
we can get back to partnership. Wouldn't that be lovely?
I never thought, I never heard the term natural order of things used in the Native American societies. They don't have that concept. That was brought
Well,
in by
they do, but not in the sense
right,
of human natural order of things.
right.
They, include the entire um, everybody, all things, all beings, all creatures are in the natural order of things. Well, I think we're going to wrap this up. Thank you for coming. I had no idea how many people were going to come to our little afternoon party. I sure appreciate it.
Hey,
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right. Francesco, I think, is going to play us off.